I believe that at the crossroads of neoconservatism, the inbuilt conservative instinct meets a hardened and tested philosophy which not only defends natural right and certain absolutes, but provides the antidote to the greatest philosophical disaster of our time, that is, the disaster of relativism. One of the precepts of my book is my firm, and I acknowledge currently unpopular, belief that ideas matter, that, as Irving Kristol put it, what rules the world is ideas. To that end, I trace how the neocons came out of the academy into Washington and then into the consciousness of our time. And if anybody doubts that it is thoughts and ideas which rule the world, one need only look at the results of relativism, the abiding philosophy of the left, and therefore of much of the West. What began as a philosophical nightmare now has real and devastating impact on our body politic. Take the recent events in Lebanon and northern Israel, which I've just come back from. Here's a conflict launched by a terror group on a democratic state. But the UN, itself the end product of relativism, and large numbers of democratic, not to mention tyrannical states, can find no way of discerning moral difference between the two sides. To them, such a war is, like all wars, a 50-50 event, a conflict in which to take a side would be to make an unacceptable value judgment. And of course, the urgent necessity, therefore, is regarded not to be the disarmament or disbandment of Hezbollah, but ceasefire, as though a return to the status quo ante is a victory for peace rather than a mockery of it. Vast populations in the West and governments, such as that of France, can apparently now find no difference between a democratic state and a terror group, between an aggressor and a defender, between a state whose intention is to save civilian life and a terror group intent on maximizing civilian casualties, between a state that builds bunkers to protect civilians from missiles and a terror group that builds bunkers to protect its missiles and then uses civilians to protect those bunkers. Relativism has created a soup in which the most childish as well as the most pernicious ideas now flourish. It's no wonder that so many people, like the BBC, rely on body counts to decide who's right. Of course, it's not hard to point out to them that this doesn't quite work. Germany lost more troops in the last war than Great Britain, but it didn't make Germany right. But this is not about right and wrong. It's about a nightmarish, nihilistic and lost philosophy desperately scouring to find moral measurements in a world which they've made entirely relativist. No wonder they can now find few other signals of legitimacy other than that they believe is provided, for instance, by suffering. Thus the emergence of Cindy Sheehan. No human being could feel anything but sympathy for the loss of her brave son, but does the fact that she lost a son really give her moral authority or military know-how? Maureen Dowd, the resident clown on the New York Times, certainly thinks so. A little while ago she described Cindy Sheehan's moral authority as absolute, which goes to demonstrate, as if it needed demonstrating, that relativists end up by becoming absolute relativists, with hierarchies and peculiar papacies quite of their own. But the result of relativism and its practical consequences do not stop at the equivalencing of democracies and tyrannies, terrorists and free men. Because relativism gives equal credit to the wrong and the right, it can and does end up with a single result, which is that the wicked is unnaturally elevated and the good maligned, the malignant raised up and the right brought low. Such a philosophical problem now affects not only our foreign policy, but the very existence of the West at home. The absurd and disingenuous proselytizing of multiculturalism over the last few decades is just such a case. This is not about the whole world becoming a melting pot, and nor is it about people being nice to each other. It's about making the West the laboratory for an experiment which can lead only to the destruction of the West. I have sympathy here with Kristol's description of multiculturalism as much a war against the West as Nazism and Stalinism ever were, and Samuel Huntington's claim that multiculturalism is in its essence anti-European civilization, an anti-Western ideology. On this question, and on this subject, the degradations of Europe and the problems of America constitute, as so often, the same problem. Border control and immigration issues here in the US have at their root exactly the same dilemma that Europeans are facing with their Muslim and other immigrant populations. At the root is the simple question of how the West can remain the West, how the West can remain a cultural and not just a physical entity, rather trying to make sure the West isn't just one in a sort of set of lifestyle-like options in which you might choose the Western tradition, but then on the other hand, if jihad's your bag, then that's fine too. An interesting mix to the dish, except that with all those ingredients going in, something overloaded it, and the whole Petri dish turned sour. Thus it is that Western governments, from America and Canada to Britain and Europe, can find no way to expel from their midst or even make stands against people who not only reject the societies which give them shelter, but actually plot against them. Canada has the sobering case of the Carter family, who have provided so many terrorists to the jihad that Mark Steins referred to them as perhaps Canada's principal contribution to the war on terror. In 2004, Mrs. Carter returned to Canada with a surviving jihadist son who required medical attention from the latest al-Qaeda shootout with the Pakistani forces that he'd been involved in. And not for Mrs. Carter the humility of the grateful applicant, but the simple statement, "I'm a Canadian and I'm not begging for my rights. I'm demanding my rights." Mrs. Carter's ungracious demand is echoed across the West from opportunist Islamists who take from us even as they plot to destroy us. Looking for a rational reason to protect ourselves, we seem to have forgotten the most rational reason of all, survival. In Britain, our government has proved incapable of expelling clerics who preach violence and subversion against the state. Holland and Denmark can find no way of booting out imams who incite murder and the overthrow of the government, and have indeed in many cases proven track records of graduates leaving for careers in Afghan caves. And of course, in Britain, only last month, the Home Secretary was once again forbidden by the law courts to expel a group of Afghan men who are only in Britain because they arrived a few years ago illegally on a plane. This wasn't any old illegality, though. No mere passport flushing on the BA loo for these guys. They arrived in Britain on a plane they hijacked themselves. And for all the guns, terrorism, and terrorized innocents involved, the British state, after many years, can still find no reason or any way to violate the human rights of hijackers by asking them to leave the country. Societies which can find no rational reason why they should not be destroyed will be destroyed, and free people who can find no way to understand what makes them superior to terrorists will find the march of history going not in their direction, but in the direction of their enemies. It isn't a clear road, of course, and among the throng are plenty of glad fools paving the way. Foremost among them today are those who claim that there is no enemy of Western civilization, or that to make such a claim is an unacceptable value judgment. Or there are those who say we cannot criticize another group because our ancestors did bad things. This is now an overwhelming arrogance of my generation, far exceeding the arrogance, I believe, even of their imperialist forebears. Those whose belief in preemption runs only to preemptive apology are now messing with people's lives, and it suddenly stopped looking cute. I lost count in the run-up to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq of the number of times Europeans and Americans told me that we, such people incidentally only ever acknowledge collective feeling when it comes to collective guilt, that we had no right to fight al-Qaeda because we created them, or had no right to overthrow Saddam Hussein because we had supported him. Put aside for a moment, if you will, the historical ignorance of these claims, and focus for a moment on why someone would make such a claim. Is it seriousness, or is it simply posing at seriousness? Is it an expression of moral maturity or of moral cowardice? I would argue it's an expression of the latter. Only a generation brought up on a diet of self-esteem and ignorance could so continually parade under the not in my name inanities of the anti-war left, in which immersion in activism is actually an opt-out from action, where you never have to deal with a tyrant or genocide, because if you glance around, you can pretty much always find someone from the West in the background who you can blame and claim makes action not only illegitimate, but, that terrible word, hypocritical. And of course, there's the prevailing presumption that choosing not to act is not itself a choice and a mode of action. So you don't want anything to happen to Mr. Ahmadinejad. So your conscience is clear? No. If you call for inaction, you're acquiescing in the acquisition of a bomb. You don't get out of the game, you just pretend to get out with your hands clean. People who think like that have got away with things for too long, and in my book I try to take the argument back to them. After all, who has more to apologize for? Someone who supports the difficult and costly overthrow of the Taliban, Saddam Hussein, or a so-called peace campaigner whose activities, if listened to, would have by now led to the subsuming of Kosovo into a greater Serbia after a successful genocide, the continued rule of Afghanistan by the Taliban, and in Iraq whose best hope for the future would be the succession of Uday Hussein. This isn't conscience, it's ignorance, profound moral and mental ignorance masquerading as seriousness.